The name Stone Cold Steve Austin echoes through wrestling history like a thunderclap that never quite fades away. The Rattlesnake who stunned his way into millions of hearts and became the face of an entire era now lives a life that few could have predicted when he was breaking bones and taking names in that squared circle. What happened to the man who once stood atop the mountain of professional wrestling with a beer in each hand and the world at his feet? The truth is far more complex than anyone imagined, and before we dive into this incredible journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what comes next. Steve Austin didn't just retire from wrestling. He was forced out by a body that had been pushed beyond its limits, a neck that had been broken and repaired but never truly healed. When he walked away from the ring in 2003, he left behind more than just a career. He left behind an identity that had consumed him for years. The Texas Rattlesnake was dead, but what was Steve Williams supposed to do with the rest of his life? The answer to that question would take him on a journey through darkness, reinvention, and ultimately a kind of peace that seemed impossible during his wrestling days. The immediate years after retirement were brutal in ways that no amount of chair shots or stunners could prepare him for. Austin struggled with his identity, wondering if he had made the right choice leaving the business when he did. The neck injuries that forced him out were severe enough that doctors warned him continuing to wrestle could result in paralysis or worse. But for a man who had defined himself by his ability to overcome any obstacle, accepting physical limitations felt like admitting defeat. He watched as the wrestling world moved on without him, as new stars emerged and the Attitude Era became a memory rather than a reality. His first marriage had already crumbled under the weight of his wrestling schedule and the demands of being stone cold. His second marriage followed suit not long after his retirement. The man who could captivate millions with a simple stare found himself unable to maintain the relationships that mattered most in his personal life. The divorce from Deborah Marshall was particularly ugly, with allegations and counter-allegations flying through the media like chairs in a backstage brawl. Austin hit a low point that had nothing to do with storylines or predetermined outcomes. But something interesting happened in those dark years. Austin began to rebuild himself piece by piece, not as Stone Cold but as Steve Austin the person. He threw himself into acting, landing small roles that eventually grew into bigger opportunities. His appearance on shows and in films wasn't going to win him an Oscar, but it gave him something to focus on besides the career he had lost. More importantly, it reminded him that he was more than just a wrestler. He could reinvent himself, could find new mountains to climb even if his body wouldn't let him climb the turnbuckles anymore. The podcast revolution came at exactly the right time for Austin. In 2013, he launched The Steve Austin Show, and suddenly the man who had once communicated primarily through middle fingers and stunners found a new way to connect with fans. Behind a microphone, without the physical demands of wrestling, Austin could be himself. He could interview other wrestlers, share stories from his career, and gradually build a new identity that honored his past without being imprisoned by it. The podcast became wildly successful, proving that people wanted to hear from Steve Austin the person just as much as they had wanted to watch Stone Cold the character. His personal life began to stabilize as well. He met Kristen Furs, and for the first time in years, Austin found a relationship that worked. They married in 2009, and while that marriage eventually ended, it represented a turning point. Austin was learning how to be vulnerable, how to admit he didn't have all the answers, how to be something other than the toughest sob in the valley. When he married Kristen Austin in 2016, it seemed like he had finally found the stability that had eluded him for so long. The physical toll of his wrestling career never went away. Austin lives with chronic pain, the kind that comes from taking thousands of bumps on a wrestling mat and absorbing punishment that would hospitalize normal people. His knees are shot. His neck will never be the same. He moves differently now, more carefully, like a man who knows that one wrong step could mean serious consequences. The simple act of getting out of bed some mornings is a challenge that Stone Cold would have powered through with pure attitude, but Steve Austin has to acknowledge and work around. What's truly fascinating is how Austin has transformed his limitations into assets. He became a spokesperson for DDP Yoga, using his platform to help other former wrestlers deal with their own physical issues. He opened up about his struggles in ways that the Stone Cold character never could have. He talked about pain, about depression, about the difficulty of transitioning from being the biggest star in wrestling to being a retired athlete trying to find purpose. This vulnerability made him more relatable, more human, and in some ways more beloved than he had been even at the height of his fame. The documentary about his life and career gave fans a look behind the curtain that few wrestling documentaries have managed. Austin didn't sugarcoat his failures or pretend that everything had always been perfect. He talked about his mistakes, his regrets, the relationships he had damaged, and the price he had paid for success. It was the kind of honesty that wrestling fans rarely get from their heroes, and it deepened the respect people had for him. His return to WWE programming in various capacities has been carefully managed. Austin knows his body can't handle a full-time schedule, can't take the bumps that once came so naturally. But every now and then, when the moment is right, he shows up. He delivers a stunner. He raises hell one more time. These appearances are bittersweet for fans who remember when Stone Cold was a weekly presence, when you could count on him to open up a can on someone every Monday night. but they're also special precisely because they're rare. Austin has become something of an elder statesman in wrestling, a legend who appears when the story calls for it but doesn't overstay his welcome. The ranch in California became Austin's refuge. He throws himself into outdoor activities, into fishing and hunting and all the things that Stone Cold the character would have loved but Steve Austin the performer never had time for. He hosts shows about the outdoors, about survival, about activities that don't require him to take bumps or cut promos. It's a different kind of performance, one that suits the man he's become rather than the character he used to play. Money isn't an issue for Austin. He made millions during his wrestling career and invested wisely enough that he doesn't need to work, but he keeps working anyway because he needs purpose. The shows, the podcasts, the appearances, they're not about the paycheck. They're about staying relevant, about having a reason to get up in the morning, about proving to himself that he's still valuable even though he can't lace up the boots anymore. This drive is both his blessing and his curse, the same quality that made him a star but also makes it hard for him to truly step away. His relationship with WWE has had its ups and downs. There were years when Austin was bitter about how his career ended, about the injuries that forced him out, about feeling like the company moved on too quickly. But time heals wounds, and Austin eventually made peace with the organization that made him famous. He understands now that wrestling is a business, that new stars have to emerge, that nostalgia is powerful but can't be the only thing the company relies on. His occasional appearances on WWE programming are on his terms now, done when he wants to do them rather than because he needs the exposure. The physical transformation has been significant. Austin doesn't look like he did during his wrestling days. He's older, obviously, but more than that he carries himself differently. The intensity that used to radiate from him like heat from asphalt has mellowed. He smiles more easily. He seems more comfortable in his own skin. The man who used to storm to the ring like a force of nature now moves like someone who has made peace with his limitations and found value in what he can still do rather than mourning what he's lost. His influence on professional wrestling cannot be overstated. Every wrestler who uses a beer-drinking, authority-defying, ass-kicking persona owes something to Stone Cold. The Attitude Era wouldn't have happened without him. WWE might not have survived the Monday Night Wars without him. He was the right character at the right time, a blue-collar everyman who said and did what millions of people wished they could say and do to their bosses, their problems, their obstacles. That legacy is secure, carved in stone in beer cans and broken glass. But legacies don't pay the bills emotionally. They don't fill the empty spaces that come when the crowds stop roaring and the cameras stop rolling. Austin has been remarkably honest about the challenges of life after wrestling, about the depression that can come when your purpose disappears, about the difficulty of building a new identity when the old one was so powerful and all-consuming. He's talked about therapy, about working on himself, about the ongoing process of figuring out who Steve Austin is when he's not Stone Cold. The podcast has become more than just a business venture. It's become Austin's way of staying connected to the wrestling world without being consumed by it. He can talk to current stars, to legends, to people from all walks of life. He can share his opinions without having to back them up with physical action. He can be thoughtful and reflective in ways that Stone Cold never could be. The microphone has replaced the championship belt as his primary tool, and he's wielded it effectively. His stepchildren from his marriage to Kristen have given Austin a chance to be something he wasn't very successful at during his career, a family man. He talks about them with genuine affection, about the joy of being present for family events, about having the time to build relationships that his wrestling schedule never allowed. It's a different kind of fulfillment than the roar of the crowd, but it's real and lasting in ways that championship reigns never were. The acting career never turned Austin into a movie star, but it gave him options and opportunities that extended beyond wrestling. He's appeared in action films, comedies, and television shows. He's not going to be confused with Daniel Day-Lewis, but he's competent and brings an authenticity to tough guy roles that few actors can match. More importantly, acting gave him another outlet, another way to perform without putting his already damaged body through more punishment. Austin's legacy in wrestling is complicated by the fact that he left when he was still relatively young and could have potentially had more years in the ring if not for the injuries. Fans wonder what might have been, what feuds and matches they missed out on, what storylines could have elevated the product during the years after his retirement. But Austin himself seems to have made peace with how things unfolded. He got out before he became paralyzed or worse. He preserved enough of his health to enjoy his later years even if those years come with pain and limitations. The Stone Cold character was built on rage and defiance, on a refusal to accept limits or authority. Steve Austin the person has had to learn the opposite lesson. He's had to accept his physical limitations, work within the constraints of his damaged body, and find meaning in activities that don't require him to be the toughest person in the room. This transformation from character to person, from performer to retiree, from icon to human being, is the real tragedy and triumph of his story. When Austin appears at wrestling events now, there's a bittersweet quality to the reaction. Fans are thrilled to see him, but there's also an awareness that these appearances are limited, that the clock is running out on opportunities to see Stone Cold in any capacity. He moves slower, talks a bit differently, seems more aware of his mortality. The invincible character has given way to a man who knows his time is finite and is trying to make the most of whatever years remain. His openness about his struggles has helped other wrestlers deal with their own transitions out of the business. Wrestling is notorious for chewing up performers and spitting them out with nothing to show for their years of sacrifice except injuries and memories. Austin has shown that it's possible to build a life after wrestling, to find new purposes and passions, to survive the transition even if it's not easy. His example matters to guys coming up behind him who wonder what happens when the music stops playing and the lights go down. The ranch work, the outdoor activities, the simple pleasures of life away from cameras and crowds, these are what sustain Austin now. He's found peace in nature, in physical activities that don't require him to perform for anyone else, in the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent doing things he enjoys. It's a far cry from the electricity of a sold-out arena, but it's real and it's his and no one can take it from them. Austin's story is ultimately about transformation and acceptance. He was forced to give up the thing that defined him, struggled through the darkness that followed, and eventually found new ways to matter and new reasons to keep going. He's not stone cold anymore except in brief flashes when the moment calls for it. He's Steve Austin, a man with a legendary past and a present that he's still figuring out one day at a time. The tragedy isn't that his career ended. The tragedy is that it had to end the way it did, with his body breaking down and forcing him out before he was ready. But the triumph is that he survived, adapted, and found ways to thrive even when everything he had built his identity around was taken away. So if you've made it this far in the story, you understand that Stone Cold Steve Austin's fate wasn't as simple as retirement or comebacks or occasional appearances. It was about a man learning to be more than his character, finding value in himself beyond what he could do in a wrestling ring, and building a life worth living even when the thing that made him famous was no longer possible. That's a journey worth following, and if you want to stay updated on more stories like this, make sure you subscribe because there are plenty more tales to tell about the legends who shaped our world and then had to figure out how to live in it once their time in the spotlight ended.